Controversy still surrounds the 1994 liberation of black South Africans, with progressive thinkers on the left questioning whether apartheid truly ended or transformed. South African YouTuber and writer Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh is amongst those on the left who argue that apartheid persists and has morphed into a corporate machine, calling it privatized apartheid. In his 2021 book, The New Apartheid, Mpofu critiques neoliberalism, asserting that its emphasis on privatization and market-driven policies has deepened racial wealth inequality and reinforced racial divides, creating a new apartheid, using the term neoliberalism pejoratively for a larger critique of capitalism. Now, Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh argues that true equitability, fairness, and balanced access to opportunities cannot be achieved through radical reformation of our economic structures, calling for a revolutionary change of our private interest-centered economical approach, claiming that they uphold a decentralized, financialized, and denationalized form of apartheid. On the other side of this controversial statement is American economist and conservative commentator Thomas Sowell, who contends that private corporation actually played a significant role in dismantling apartheid. Thomas Sowell argues that market forces along with global economic pressures pushed South African businesses to recognize the inefficiencies and the costs of apartheid, contributing to its collapse eventually. Now, through this analysis, I will explore 5 points where free market thinkers like Sowell challenge Mpofu-Walsh's portrayal of capital and argue the worthiness of the market dynamics characterizes beyond democratic accountability. Now, why Thomas Sowell? It is important to note that Thomas Sowell is not out of touch with the socio-economic environment of South Africa, as it shares vast similarities with America. Now, as Phumlani Josi, political economist and speaker, he states that the Jim Crow era is the American equivalent of apartheid. Fatherlessness is a problem in both countries, and the United States has also initiated racial economic policies which had disastrous effects on the groups that they are attempting to assist. They have the BEE equivalents in the form of DEI and affirmative action. Therefore, his claim that private interest ended apartheid should not be taken lightly. Disclaimer, I will accept Sizwe's characterization of neoliberalism for the sake of argument, and only disagree with the diagnosis on the latter parts of the video. Thomas Sowell takes a nuanced stance to the market dynamics that Dr. Sizwe views as drivers of privatized apartheid. In his book Discrimination and Disparities, Thomas Sowell claims that discrimination towards a particular group has an effect to the discriminator that extends beyond moral standing, because employers have to weigh the incentives and constraints for every decision they take. The apartheid-era entrepreneurs were not exempt from these fundamentals of business. Like all decisions, racism has consequences. Thus, Mr. Sowell argues that the racialized labor laws that characterized apartheid often made profitability difficult because they limited the labor pool and created inefficiencies with arbitrary laws. The repair shop owner would have to hire from a small pool of white workers whose labor value would be artificially increased by black exclusion. Hence, white employers would often hire more blacks and in higher occupations than they were allowed to. Thomas Sowell said that this sentiment remained true also in white-only housing, where the cost of not renting to non-whites occasionally outweighed the cost of disobeying segregationist policies, leading to whites renting out houses to non-blacks in white-only areas. The private sector, which pursued profit, paid a higher cost to discrimination as compared to the state, which pursued votes. Concessions to black participation, Thomas states, shows no evidence of a fundamental difference in attitude towards black people between the worker who voted in the favor of segregation and the businessman who voted against it. It is simply that the economic cost of discrimination reached an all-time high during the 1970s, when growing sanctions and labor strikes led to the South Africa's worst recession since World War II, which forced widespread reformation of apartheid laws, such as the Vian Commission, which legitimized black unions, leading to the Ari Polish, member of the Afrikaner-dominated Mine Workers Union, denouncing the report as the greatest treachery against the white employees of South Africa since 1922, where hundreds of miners were shot because they opposed the Chamber of Mines who tried to force them to share their work with blacks. Further, reforms were initiated by the Ricket Commission of 1981, which was an investigation report initiated by Minister of Planning, B.D. du Plessis, to address labor and urban policy issues amid rising unrest and economic pressure, which eventually led to the parliament easing labor regulations to satisfy labor demands. Furthermore, in the same decade, the apartheid government introduced further reforms by allowing employers to employ black workers in higher ranked positions than previously allowed. As Thomas Sowell put it, the economic incentives of black participation began to outstrip the political incentives of racial segregation. Now, Sizwe disagrees with Thomas' claims about this period, claiming that it was to, quote, Creating a black middle class, this would remove our economic power from the state and displace it to the corporate world, while also enmeshing a black power class into the economy. This enmeshment would conflict black people between material and political aspirations. This statement ignores the fact that the biggest threat to established wealth is the middle class. As fellow YouTuber analyzing finance with Nick observes in this clip,
the main enemy of old money is not the poor. In fact, they often have a paternalistic relationship with the poor because they feel like since they're the stewards of society, because they have been the ones who've been on the top for the longest, that they're kind of in a paternalistic way responsible for the lower classes. The real enemy of the old money is the middle class and potential new money. If you have a generous enough of a safety net that people are comfortable and or middle paying jobs that are comfortable enough that people can have the basic comforts without a need to rebel, but they don't pay enough that people can accumulate savings to build capital, to create businesses, or their own forms of influence to challenge the current social hierarchy, that's the ideal.
Furthermore, to claim that it creates a buffer implies that capital creates internal divisions within the black population, which assumes that there is such a thing as black unity, neglecting how during the 2024 elections, there are communists and capitalists within the black population. Therefore, to claim, quote, conflict between material and political aspirations is ambiguous, and it assumes that black people are on the same aspirational page, and there are just some of us who are conflicted. And the word buffer should be replaced with pacifier, because there is no world where the rich prefer a middle class to a poor class, because the poor can provide cheap labor. So two mistakes are embedded in this code. One, thinking that black people are a unit, and two, assuming that the rich fear the poor more than they do the middle class. Simply put, the 1970s and the 1980s were a concession to market dynamics. Now, before moving forward with the argument, I suggest we read the ideological temperature. Peter J. Klein, professor of entrepreneurship at Baylor University, Hancock School of Business, points out that a minority are tempted to conflate the fight against apartheid as a fight against communism.
So because the white minority also was heavily involved in production and were owners of factories and so on, it was assumed that the apartheid system was not only a system of racial prejudice, but also a system that favored capitalism and capitalists at the expense of workers. So the black liberation movement in South Africa was conflated with some kind of worker liberation movement.
The lowering of racial labor laws can be best described as a shift from state to public rather than state to private. Our claim is contradicted by Sizwe's claim that, quote, the private sector masquerades as the public. And within this excerpt lies the defining philosophical question of this video. Is a state that partakes in extensive economic planning more representative of the public more than the private corporation? Copilot AI defines democratic control as a system of governance or management where decision-making power is distributed among all members of a group or an organization, rather than being concentrated in the hands of a few individuals. And seeing that Sizwe has made a plethora of controversial statements in his book, I think I reserve the right to make one too. I contend that the market constraints of supply and demand are by definition within the confines of democratic participation. Think about it like this. South Africa has a 5-year election cycle, but the demand that drives the wheel of cooperation confronts us every day, meaning mass approval of private goods and services determine whether they will remain available in the market. What do you think would happen if there was a nationwide boycott of a certain product? It is on these grounds that Yetibe rejects the statement. Just as democracy dawned in South Africa, the private economy became encased in its own autonomous sphere and separated from the dangerous forces of popular accountability. Because entrepreneurs know a bit about popular accountability, and claiming that private economy is beyond popular accountability, he accuses the democratic system of favoring the wealthy in our society. Page 151 of the new Apartheid. The more wealth a citizen enjoys, the more democratic influence she or he enjoys. Hence, economic equality cannot be neatly severed from political inequality. Democracy and inequality are not only compatible but often mutually reinforcing. He cites the research of Thomas Ferguson and Larry Bartels to show how the democratic system already lends more influence on the wealthier people in a society. The first scholar of Thomas Ferguson argues that American political parties funded by the wealthy tend to push for policies that favor the rich, except when the left calls for increased taxes on the rich and the right calls for reduced taxes on the rich. It is not simply that the left makes the rich less rich, because often the increased taxation among high earners reduces the incentive and ability to become a high earner and reduces the competition within markets, which is why taxing the rich is not something that necessarily hurts the rich. Hence, Hungarian-American businessmen and investors support a progressive candidate like Kamala Harris, far from a shot in the foot.
This explains why a lot of old money support progressive taxation, is because they've already made their money. So they're not really hurt by progressive taxation nearly as much. Whereas anybody who is an up-and-comer who is trying to move up in the world, they are hurt because they're going to have to give a big chunk of their earnings and wealth to the government as they move up, and it may prevent them from moving up to begin with because they won't be able to compound the same amount of wealth that the previous generations were able to do. And that, along with the regulatory barriers to entry, keep new money competition out of old money circles. So that's why you could see a lot of these progressive economic policies actually serve the interests of old money.
The second researcher he mentioned was Larry Bartels, who sees the tax cuts of 2001, 2003 and 2017 tax policies as clear examples of how lawmakers prioritize the interest of the affluent members of our society. For this point, I will refer users to my previous assertion, but Larry Bartels goes on to state that policies deprioritize the needs of low-income Americans by reducing funding for safety net programs, which is a statement that is hard to defend in the context of the United States of America. Because as Ben Shapiro states in this next video, low-income individuals are often not low income forever.
When you talk about the gap between the rich and the poor, these are not stable groups of people. Okay, people go from the bottom quintile to the top quintile and back down to the second quintile and back up and back down. The way that you solve for wealth gaps in the United States is with better income mobility, and that only comes with an opportunity economy that allows people to move forward based on their efforts.
I remain skeptical of his cynicism towards the private sector, because it appears to stem from the notion that the minimalized regulations characterized by the neoliberal perspectives are incapable of holding the best interest of the people. Turn to page 59 of the new Apartheid. Let's go a bit back, where Dr. Sizwe asserts his skepticism of free market promises. Neoliberal economists claim that an invisible hand pervades the economy, and a rising tide lifts all boats. Just as neoliberal economists promise prosperity by trickle, so triumphant constitutionalists promise justice by osmosis. Indeed, the human rights paradigm and neoliberal paradigm reinforce one another. As Wikipedia suggests, the Constitution recognizes socio-economic rights of all human beings. And at the same time, the neoliberal socio-economic structures annul such rights. I agree our constitutional understanding of freedom and human dignity are best suited for a neoliberal approach. America says freedom and equality more than the Soviet Union. So how does Sizwe substantiate these claims against neoliberalism? In support of Wikipedia's expressions, Sizwe speaks comprehensively about space and technology as examples of neoliberal annihilation of human rights, articulating that human technology allows digitally and algorithmically tailored social media systems to perpetuate individual biases. He claims that this leads to a reinforcement of existing systems of oppression and some form of social inequality. Now, furthermore, Dr. Mpofu-Walsh observes that urban spaces in South Africa are becoming more and more segregated, with wealthier citizens in gated communities, while poorer areas decline, stating that it creates physical and social divides, diminishes public space, and blurs the line between public and private interests, limiting democratic interactions and deepening social divisions. Now, to summarize his position, the realities of spatial segregation and technological advancements systematically undermine human rights through increased tracking, algorithmic biases, and privatization of public spaces. Sizwe argues that searches of private influence in such fields stem from neoliberal promises of prosperity, equality, and the trickle-down effect that do not automatically materialize. Space and technology form part of his arguments against trickle-down economics, made famous by the great Ronald Reagan. For context, Copilot AI defines trickle-down economics as the idea that advantages provided to the business will eventually trickle down to the rest of the economy. Sizwe and the rest of the progressive left want to characterize this as some vague promise that protects wealth. Now, some time ago, Young America's Foundation hosted a debate between Ben Shapiro and Cenk Uygur. In this video, the latter attempted to use the same chess move, and was, of course, unsuccessful.
What spurs the economy is the creation of new products and services, and that is only going to be done by people who have expendable capital to actually invest in the new products and services that we all enjoy. This is what creates economic growth. It's also worth noting that this myth that spending is inherently better for an economy than saving, that's only true if you're talking about somebody's actually taking the cash and just shoving it into their mattress. Banks are in the business of lending. When they take the money in, they don't just stick it in Al Gore's fake lockbox. They actually lend the money back out to people to actually create new businesses and new products. You had an investor, right? When you started TYT, you were given $4 million by Buddy Romer to start TYT. That's great. That's the way business should work, right? But that money it didn't come from a bunch of poor people buying hamburgers. It came from a very, very wealthy guy who gave you money to create a business a lot of people want to patronize. If you want better products and better services, you need more investment in the products and services. The basic name, trickle-down economics. The basic name trickle-down economics is not something that any conservative even proposed. It's a leftist revision of what economics actually is, because you're not giving me the money. It was my money in the first place, created through voluntary transactions that I had with others. I've not stolen money from anyone, neither have you. And the idea that money has to be forcibly taken from you and handed to somebody at the bottom end of the economic spectrum to somehow jog the economy, that may jog McDonald's, but is not going to jog all of the creation of the products and services that make all of our lives much better today than they were 30 years ago in terms of the stuff we have access to.
Gotcha. Gotcha.
Increased taxes for welfare funding are also a similar form of distribution of lower persons in our society. It just so happens that that system is failing us currently. What in the world is neoliberalism? Before we defend this virus called neoliberalism, we should first outline what the word means. We should first outline what the general characterization of neoliberal economies are, which first requires an understanding of the word. The reason why it is called neoliberalism, not liberalism, is because it is a post-Great Depression challenge to classic liberalism. The term itself emanated among 1930s German and Austrian intellectuals who sought an alternative to the failure of unregulated markets and the tyranny of socialists. The goal was to minimize economical regulation, to allow the market to drive economic growth, and enough regulation to preserve the consumer safety and economic stability, while also supporting competitive markets and minimized monopolies. This is to be achieved through these means: market-driven economy, minimal state involvement in the economy, market deregulation, limited taxation, reduced welfare states, and globalized free trade. In the introduction, I mentioned how neoliberalism has become a pejorative term, and how when someone is criticizing neoliberalism, they're usually attacking capitalism. So here we are. Does the South African economy remotely resemble any of these characteristics mentioned?
No, I don't think so. No, it's not.
No, not at all. But this neoliberal world, which could just as easily be replaced with New World Order, the ANC that implemented race-based economic policies, like the BEE, and has been flirting with the concept of universal healthcare since 2007. If I recall well, in the conference in Polokwane, which under Jacob Zuma increased the VAT rate from 14% to 15%, while also increasing the top marginal tax rate to 41%. His successor, Cyril Ramaphosa, further increased the top marginal tax rate to 45%. All in vain attempts to meet the growing misguided compassion of South Africa's extensive welfare program. Therefore, we reject the statement presented on page 21, which states that ANC fundamentally reshaped its economic policy following the dictates of neoliberal orthodoxy, with few exceptions. Because the exceptions were far from few. Political analyst Dr. Franz Cornier claims that within 13 years from democratic takeover of the ANC government, the ANC recorded the first sustained budget surplus since the Union of South Africa. Furthermore, fixed investment to GDP, which is the ratio of investments in things such as machinery, buildings, infrastructure, relative to a country's GDP, almost reached emerging market standards. These are also the years where the dictates of neoliberalism described by Sizwe were at their peak, even if the country could not be described as traditionally neoliberal. Remarkably, this is when the class divide that haunts Sizwe and the rest of the country was at its lowest. However, Sizwe refuses to see the beauty. Well, yes, I said it, the beauty in the high performance of these years. Instead, he describes it so time and time again in South Africa's early experiment with democracy. Public ambitions for justice and equality have been frustrated by private actors. Justice in South Africa is about restoring what was stolen by unjust means and repairing that which was broken by unjust acts. It is about land and wealth. But as Tom explains in his book Discrimination and Disparities, the crucial question is not whether evils exist, but whether the evils of the past are present and automatically the cause of major economic, educational, and other social disparities. Today, truthfully, it is not only the injustices of the past, but South Africa's poor and arbitrarily inclusive economic policy also stand trial for the murder of the economy. The neoliberal pillar of privatization is what bothers Sizwe so much and leads him to a mischaracterization of neoliberalism. The principle of privatization as a neoliberal cornerstone was engraved by the tenures of Ronald Reagan, 40th President of the United States. Privatization is a form of government shrinkage that distributes government obligation into private hands. Dr. Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh critiques neoliberalism as a pivotal force that has shaped the contemporary landscape of South Africa, arguing that it has led to the privatization and decentralization of power, which perpetuates the structures of apartheid in a new form. Many South African free marketeers, such as I, and such as the folks of the Institute of Race Relations, have heard the cries and have built compelling cases for privatization. A paper authored by John K. Berman states that these are the four advantages of privatization: reduced private debt, increased competition and efficiency, increased investment and economic growth, and reduced political influence. Adiba stated months ago that free marketeers do not believe in anarchy. Therefore, I would like to focus on ways in which privatization does not lead to the good old bad privatization, which was seen in Russia's shock therapy problem, the United Kingdom's railway services, and monopolistic practices in 1990s Latin America, telecommunications and utilities. To mitigate this risk, the Institute of Race Relations, such as that the independent regulatory bodies should be established. These bodies would regulate sectors which limited competition and protect consumers from unfair practices and pricing. Now, John K. Berman asserts that South Africa must submit to some form of privatization or risk going bust. The financial burden placed on the state, rather the taxpayers via the bailouts to SOEs, threaten the financial stability of the government and the country as a whole. Instead, he sees more benefit in Keynesianism, an economic theory named after English economist and philosopher Maynard Keynes. Keynesianism is aid provided by the state during the Depression, often through employment-intensive government infrastructure programs. Dr. Sizwe argues that economic growth should be stimulated by increased government spending, and not individual or private increment of debt to simulate growth and mitigate economic downturns, and describes such a system as privatized Keynesianism. Sizwe, like the meticulous writer that he is, substantiates his argument with a case study, and this is where his argument goes completely wrong, because Sizwe cites the New Deal as evidence or proof of the effectiveness of government spending, saying that it, quote, rescued the US from the clutches of the Great Depression. For context, the Great Depression is the greatest economic crash in modern history. It began with a stock market crash in America and triggered a crisis of global proportions, which led to decreased industrial production, bank failures, job losses, and widespread poverty. It is often wrongly cited that the New Deal, a boatload of policies and programs implemented by FDR, helped alleviate this crisis. The programs and policies which involved high government spending and regulations include civilian conservation corps, which employed young men in conservation programs such as reforestation and park development, works program administrations with estimated budget of $11 billion, employed millions of Americans in various public works projects and paid the millions of Americans it employed at similar wages to private sector jobs. Public Works Administrations will spend $6 billion on large-scale infrastructure projects like hospitals, schools, and highways. The last I will reference, but certainly not the least important, National Industrial Recovery, which permanently changed the American government's relationship with the private sector. Enacted in 1933, it gave businesses the ability to set wages and prices and control production levels. To the idealist eye, this may seem like a noble task, but the UCLA researchers Harold Cole and Lee Ohanian argue this indifference to market dynamics only resulted in the Great Depression to be extended by 7 years. Now, the large government that Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh promotes practiced fixed pricing and wages and controlled output, which led to practices that hindered economic growth. Because as it turns, the artificial constraints placed on businesses often lead to monopolies, limit expansion capacity, and hinder business growth, because it is often the big businesses that are able to cope with the taxation and regulation that comes with big government. Here are Thomas Sowell's remarks on the New Deal.
Smoot Hawley tariff. When FDR came in 1933, he then put in the National Industrial Recovery Act. He put in the Agricultural Adjustment Act. He put in the Wagner Act. He issued more presidential executive orders than all subsequent presidents throughout the remainder of the 20th century. So the government intervened on a massive scale, and yet the unemployment never came down below double digits for the entire decade.
So we get the stock market crash in 29. Herbert Hoover, as president, understands that something terrible has happened, but fundamentally the policies in place are those of Calvin Coolidge and every president before, small federal government, and we see signs that the market begins to correct itself.
Right.
The economy begins to recover, and then Herbert Hoover and Congress decide what to do to fix things.
Yes.
And they immediately make things worse, and Franklin Roosevelt comes in and keeps fixing it and keeps fixing it and keeps fixing it, and it stays bad, bad, bad.
Yes.
That's a fair assessment?
Yes.
Okay.
In simple terms, the New Deal was disastrous. Benefits that are often mistakenly attributed to these programs as signs of improvement are the results of the Second World War. As Ben Shapiro, chief pundit of Daily Wire, claims, these are the two key factors that led to post-World War II economic improvement. 1. Economic deregulation. And Europe was destroyed, which led to a shortage of mass producers. And subscribing to our channel and liking this video. Now, the doctor contrasts the New Deal recovery model with the South African government's approach, which he sees as being unnecessarily restrained by monetary needs and financial obligations, rather than the idealism outlined by FDR's New Deal. Idealism in the Oxford Dictionary is defined as the unrealistic belief in a pursuit or perfection. He gives undue praises to the programs, but also states on page 145 that if what I have said in this book is true, then the country we know as South Africa must consider far-reaching, even revolutionary political changes. Sizwe believes that the government should inherit that in times of crisis instead of people. Except government is people, just like business is people. And if he wants government to spend money, he wants South African citizens' money to be spent by the government. Keynesianism is far from an admirable economic theory, Sizwe. May I take the bait now? May I be the money-hungry conservative that calls those who want to be fair Marxists? After all, Jordan Peterson famously says that when you have something to say, silence is a lie. Thus, borderline Marxist statements like this place me under a conundrum. To eat or not to eat.
To be or not to be? That is the question.
After the fall of the Berlin Wall, free market capitalism gained domestic and international precedence. The voter became akin to a consumer and the government akin to a firm. And the human being was now defined as an atomized, competitive, and irreducibly economic being. These revolutionary far-reaching changes that Sizwe mentions speaks about regarding property rights, race and gender-based reparations, are signs of a man who will cut off his nose to spite his face. But I will not take the bait today. Subscribe and like to see if I'll take it tomorrow. It is here, gentlemen, that we close our statement as Yedibe. Good day.